to the prick in the back. It was something that he didn't look forward to with relish. Victor Lord appeared in the cockpit, or at least his face did. "What the hell is that?" "Well," Kyle said, hoping that sarcasm was not going to be the main reason. Of snow, fog, and smoke. "They're still fucking alive down there." He was right. Lurkers were wandering around, despite the flames licking around their bodies. There were bodies scattered haphazardly across the snow, smoking, burning, the carcasses of the creatures whose brains had finally succumbed to the fire engulfing the hosts. "Looks like our jeep went that way," Victor said, pointing down to the track in the snow, "and left one fuck of a mess in its wake." Kyle felt something like pride in that moment. Pure, unadulterated admiration for the group who had caused such wonderful carnage. "Do you think we can catch them up?" Victor asked, although it wasn't so much a question as a disguised order. "I think that we will, eventually," Kyle said, knowing that he would do everything in his power to drag the whirlybird's ass as slowly as possible towards their target. "We don't know how long ago this happened. All we do know is that they're heading for Jackson. One way or the other, we'll get to them." He spoke the words, but knew that they were pointless. He would make sure that Shane and the others were unharmed, even if that meant bringing the bird down. "Just keep on going," Victor said. "I want that fucking jeep before sundown." "Captain, I need to speak with you about this weather," Kyle said, hoping to buy a few more moments. "You do know that if it continues like this for much longer, we're gonna have to set her down. It's too dangerous, and I ain't one for heroics." "We keep going," Victor said, chomping down on his unlit cigar. "Until I say when." "You're in charge," Kyle said, returning to the previous altitude. "But don't say I didn't tell you so when she decides to shut down in midair." The nerves in the cockpit were palpable, although Victor didn't speak for almost another minute. Either he was in deep thought, or he hadn't heard correctly. "Keep going," Victor finally said. "Is anybody else hungry?" Marla asked. Her stomach rumbled even as she spoke. "I was too busy thinking about weapons to consider food." "There are some snacks in my pack," Terry said, jabbing a thumb in the air. "You can have anything you like, just don't touch the barbecue Pringles." Marla tutted and reached for the pack. "Where the hell did you get Pringles from?" "A few weeks ago when I went out with that soldier Moon. I wish I got more of them now." She unzipped the pack and fumbled around inside. Amongst other things, she found a packet of lifesavers, a box of milk duds, and several packets of mints. She wondered whether these had been considered essentials, or whether Terry had simply grabbed what he could while he had the chance. It didn't matter. Her stomach was cartwheeling inside her. She was just grateful that at least one of them had the foresight to pack a few things. She opened a Reese's Nutrageous bar and bit into it. Taking most of it with her first bite, it tasted good, and it gave her a head rush as she swallowed that she hadn't anticipated. She offered Jared the other half, but he declined silently. She shrugged. "Suit yourself." The other half tasted just as good as the first, and she smacked her lips in what could only be described as an uncouth manner. She stared out the back of the jeep as the snow-blanketed land passed beneath them. There was something comforting about the snow, and yet she shivered as she watched it drift to the ground. It was never ending, and there was no sign of it relenting. She became hypnotized by the tire tracks they left on the road, and found herself drifting off towards sleep, although not quite. It would have been nice to sleep, perchance to dream. She wasn't sure how many hours remained of daylight. Whatever, it wouldn't be enough. After dark, those things seemed to become more prevalent. They were far from nocturnal, but the darkness seemed to offer them some sort of sanctuary, as if they felt safer after sundown. The last thing she wanted was to be stuck out in the middle of nowhere once the night arrived. What if the snow continued to fall this thickly? What if they beached or skidded off the road? They would be left at the mercy of the night, and that thought was the kind of thing that prevented her from closing her eyes. Jared was humming something melancholic. He was surprisingly quite tuneful. Sure, he was never going to win one of those TV talent shows, but then again, nobody else was either, not anymore. Apart from Jared's haunting rendition of something she didn't recognize, everything was silent. It was nice, peaceful, and she felt every muscle in her body relax as if she had been put in a trance, and then everything went wrong. Up front there were shouts, Terry screaming something. It all happened so fast. She turned to find Jared, bug-eyed, trying to figure out what was happening, what was about to happen. They felt the Jeep slip to the side, and then the other, and then Marla watched out the back as the sky became ground, and then sky, and then ground. They were like rag dolls being tossed around inside a spin dryer, metal being torn apart, which was nowhere near as comforting as Jared's soulful humming just a few seconds ago, and then an almighty thunk. The right-hand side of the snatch shrunk to about half its original size. Jagged metal and broken glass filled the space where there had been nothing but a moment before. She hit the side, then the roof, then Jared, who was crying something incomprehensible. And that was about all she remembered. End of the show, good night, and thank you for coming. Don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out. When the spin cycle came to an abrupt end, she was already standing alone in the darkness, surrounded by nothingness, wondering what the fuck had just happened. Pulling, tugging, her legs and then her ass, hands everywhere, trying to get at her, trying to... lurkers. She kicked out high and wide, although something cried out as she made contact with a shoulder or a cheek. She screeched, but the pain in her head was too much to bear. The hands grabbed at her, at least 4 of them, pulling her, trying to drag her forward any second now, she thought, and there would be pain as teeth sunk into her flesh. And then it would be too late. End of the road for this poor cow. She kicked once more, the pain in her leg, which she would later discover to be just a mild sprain, nothing more, was not going to prevent her from doing everything in her power to stay on the right side of death. She couldn't see properly, but she knew she was still in the snatch, or most of her was. Blood filled her eyes, and sweat, and probably tears. She was burning up, despite the fact that it must have been below freezing, and then some, outside the vehicle. The hands held her feet down, trying to keep her from kicking out, and then a voice said, "Marla, it's okay, Marla, please." She recognized it, the dulcet tones of a man who she trusted. It was Shane's voice, which meant that it was Shane's hands trying to restrain her, which meant that it had been Shane's shoulder, arm, head that she had connected with when she had kicked out. She blinked the blood away from her eyes and began to breathe. It hurt. Fuck, did it hurt. She didn't know how badly injured she was, not then, but the pain made it quite obvious that her insides were not where they used to be. Probably smeared all over the Jeep like strange theatrical decor, the kind you were apt to see in a French cinema. "Everything's going to be okay," Terry's voice calmly informed her. "You just need to breathe." Well, thanks for that useful nugget of gin, she thought. I almost forgot about that little-known survival technique known as breathing. "Can you move?" Shane asked. "If you can move, I want you to try to wriggle forward." I think I can," Marla replied, and was surprised that she actually could. Plus, Shane wouldn't have been asking her to try moving if her innards were scattered all over the Jeep, so that was a bonus, too. She fought through the pins and needles, and managed to slide a few feet down, aided by hands that were obviously a little nervous about where to touch. I'm a girl, she thought, not a fucking Ming Voss. Her vision was coming back, and a few more blinks would be enough to allow her to see, albeit through pink-tinted lenses. "What happened?" she asked, pushing herself up onto her haunches, and hoping that the click her back made was nothing too serious. "I don't remember. Bright Eyes here decided to swerve for a deer," Terry said. He was dusting down the leather cover of his Bible. God forbid anything should happen to that. I didn't see it until it was too late, Shane said, not taking the bait. I didn't have much of a choice. My reflexes took over. Jared, who was sitting in the snow looking as glum as ever, said, "Well, we are truly fucked now." Terry sighed. "This is not the time nor the place for amateur dramatics," he said, shoving the Bible into his jacket and zipping it back up. He still had the cheery disposition of an uncle at Christmas time. "Besides, we have more things to worry about than the hordes of undead after our tasty asses." He pointed to the sky. "We're more than likely going to freeze to death if we don't find somewhere to bed down for the night." Shane, suddenly all ears, snapped into life. "We don't have time to sleep," he said. "My wife and daughter, remember?" Marla stretched, as if she had just been roused from a rather enjoyable catnap. "Terry's right," she said, pulling her hood up and stepping cautiously out of the wreckage. Terry helped her forward, unsure if she was just going to buckle beneath her own weight. He seemed relieved when she didn't. "We're still... how many miles?" 42, Jared said, pointing a finger towards a sign at the edge of the road. "And I'll be damned if you think I'm walking it." To Shane, Marla said, "We can look for a vehicle, try to find something to get us moving again, but we need warmth and we need something to eat. There's no point turning up in Jackson with no energy. For all we know, the place is going to be overrun with lurkers." Shane's face contorted. He hadn't thought about that, not since the barracks. "You know she's making sense," Terry said. He jumped up and down a few times on the spot in an attempt to keep warm. Shane span an about turn and put both hands behind his head. "Shit!" he snarled. He turned back to face Terry and Marla, and when he did, his face was full of strength, determination, steel. "Okay," he said. "But first thing in the morning and we move forward. Remember, I didn't ask any of you along. You came through choice. If you don't like what I'm doing, then head back." He thought for a moment before adding, "You know I care about all of you, but my family are out there. Somewhere. I just want to get to them. I just want them to be safe." How did you respond to that? Marla wanted to grab the big fool and pull him into the tightest clinch she could. If she did, though, she would probably keel over under her own pain. "We best get moving," Terry said. "We do not want to be stuck out here once the moon is up." "Are you okay to walk?" Shane asked. Marla nodded, hissing as she put weight on her right foot. It hurt, but it wasn't broken, just sprained. Being a doctor or former doctor had its little perks, and one of those was self-assessment. The snatch was beyond repair, despite the thousands of dollars spent on extra armor. It was the mechanical equivalent of brain dead. The front was a crumpled mess, and multicolored cables and wires hung out of the hood like dead octopi tentacles. Even if they were able to get it running again, which would have been a feat of modern engineering, 3 of the 4 tires were punctured. 2 were already flat, while the third hissed as air slipped out through a glass-gouged hole. "Probably would have ended up crashing it anyway," Marla said, faking a smile at her own optimistic prediction. The snow, however, made it more of a certainty than just a blind guess. "Did anyone see where that deer went?" Terry said as he scaled the embankment leading back up to the road. "I always thought I would go back to vegetarian, but considering the current situation, a bit of venison never hurt anybody, did it?" Shane knew that Terry was honestly considering hunting the deer down, although he presumed it would be long gone by now, counting its lucky stars, or not really knowing how close it had come to bouncing off an armored windshield. The sign said 42 miles Jackson, but it also said 3 miles Sandown. "What do you think's in Sandown?" Marla said, limping, clinging onto Shane's shoulder until she was sure she had the strength and the nerve to walk on her lonesome. "Lurkers," Terry said without taking a breath. "Lots of lurkers, but plenty of food." Terry was to be proved right on both counts. 19. Things were bad. Susie Bloom knew it, Maggie Cox knew it. The entire goddamn camp knew it. But there was nothing like a bit of icing on a cake, and that came in the form of silence. "Shh," Susie said. "Do you hear that?" "Mommy, you're scaring me," Kelly said, latching onto her mother's cardigan. "It's okay, honey," Susie said, stroking Kelly's hair. "There's nothing there, but the generators appear to have stopped." "Well, wouldn't that just be a splendid turn of events?" Maggie said, lighting a cigarette, coughing a few times, and then going in for a second, deeper drag. "I don't hear anything," Kelly said in a high-pitched tone that suggested her mother was either hearing things or had gone completely Coco Loco. "That's what I'm afraid of," Susie said. Henry Colburn, who was now tied to a chair in the middle of the corridor, began to tut. "You know what you need?" he asked, and despite his face being hidden by the darkness, it was evident that he was smiling, grinning even, like the maniac that he was. "Shut up," Maggie said. "You lost the privilege to talk when you tried to fucking kill me." Kelly gasped as the curse word resonated around the hallway. It was a funny word, though, wasn't it? Kelly thought so and began to silently mouth it to herself, though she would never dare to say it out loud, not while her mother was around. "What you need is somebody to fix the generators," Colburn continued. The fact that he was bound to a chair at the mercy of two very pissed-off ladies and a wet behind-the-ears little girl seemed to have no bearing on him at all. "And I think you'll find that I'm the only fucker in this hellhole who has the slightest idea how to make 'em work again." "Bullshit," Susie said, and then apologized to Kelly, who was somewhat proud of her mother's outburst. "You don't know a thing about those generators. You're a soldier, not a mechanic. The only thing you know is how to murder old ladies when they least expect it." She paused a beat, and then added, smiling, "And you couldn't even do that right." "I'm not that old," Maggie said, slightly offended. "I've just had a difficult life." "I know how to make 'em run again," he said, his voice hoarse and thick in the darkness. He spat, a globule of blood and bile landing at Susie's feet. "Well, you're quite the charmer, aren't you?" Maggie said, drawing on her cigarette and exhaling a plume of blue-gray smoke. "But if you think we're letting you go after what you tried to pull, you've got another thing coming." And then Henry Colburn did something that none of them expected. In fact, it caught Maggie so much by surprise that she almost fell into the wall. He laughed. And he laughed. He was like the evil villain in a James Bond movie, only worse. He was laughing so hard that tears began to stream down his face. If they thought he was a maniac before, then now he was totally fucking bonkers. "I'm not listening to this anymore," Susie said, taking Kelly by the hand and leading her away from the lunatic in the chair. Maggie followed, although she couldn't help feeling a sense of foreboding, as if somewhere along the line this man, this wacko, was going to have to be untied. And the fact that the nutjob who professed to hold the key to repair the generators was highly unstable would fall by the wayside. "You'll be back," Colburn chuckled, practically foaming at the mouth. "I guarantee it." As Maggie hobbled forward, had she hurt her leg during the attack? She wasn't sure. She knew that everything had taken a turn for the worse. What about Victor Lord? What happens when he gets back from his little hunting expedition to find that his man had failed, been overpowered by a weak old lady and a mother? Surely there would be no happy ending. No way. As Maggie Cox smoked her way down the stairs, back to the remnants of civilization, if ever there could be such a thing, she prayed for God to take her the next time she fell asleep. Rather him than someone else. Sandown was barely even a town. There were a few stores, raided of course, and in the middle of the square there was a bronze statue of a man on a horse. The figure sitting atop the steed actually reminded Shane of Governor Charles Dean, the man who had gone out of his way to make every prisoner in Jackson feel like a piss puddle. He even had the same mustache, which bordered on Victorian and would not have looked out of place on the set of some ridiculous British period drama. "Well, this is all kinds of creepy," Marla said. The cut on her head had stopped bleeding, and her eyes were once again focused. For a while back there, Shane had been concerned. "Looks like the whole town was overrun," Terry said. He was holding the shotgun, ready for action, which made perfect sense, as they were walking into the unknown. "Either that," Shane said, "or they're waiting, hiding out, hoping for someone to ride to their rescue." "Well, good luck with that," Marla muttered. "We're all waiting to be rescued. It's just some of us have considered the possibility that the cavalry is no longer searching." She was right. If there had been remaining government, wouldn't they have tried to transmit, perhaps a shortwave radio message for all the survivors? That was what happened in the movies. That was how it should have happened now. Of course it didn't, though. There was no Morgan Freeman to tell everyone to remain calm using that magnificent voice of his. There were no military heroes screaming, "Get to the chopper!" whenever the shit hit the fan. This was real. It was happening without the aid of a film crew and sound engineers. Across the square was a small building. Shane would have used the word bungalow had he known whether it was indeed the right word for the job. Nevertheless, he walked towards it, feet crunching through the snow. It was so deep now that his boots had started to fill up. He would have to find some taller boots, or, failing that, he would fashion a pair out of a couple of plastic bags and an elastic band. He had seen that on TV once. "What is it?" Jared asked, keeping close to Terry. The man holding the biggest gun was obviously the best man to stick by. "Looks like some sort of school," Shane replied, rubbing his hands together and making a mental note to add gloves to the list of things to keep me alive. Marla kicked the sign next to the gate, forgetting that she had recently been involved in a very painful accident. She winced as the snow covering the sign dropped down, revealing the words, "Sandown Elementary," the best start they could wish for. "Yep," Marla hissed through clenched teeth. The pain from being so stupid was obviously affecting her. "It's a fucking school." So Sandown had a school, a few shops, none of which looked apt to store anything useful unless Marla decided to take up needlecraft during the night, and a bronze statue of a man that looked like someone Shane had previously detested with an unhealthy passion. It was hardly going to increase morale amongst the troops, although Shane found himself picturing school dinners from his own childhood. That, he thought, might make all the difference. The snow was sheeting down now, whipping at their ears like miniature razor blades. If they were going to make a decision, now was the time. "Votes for the school," Shane said. Although he already knew the outcome, 6 hands went up faster than a blink. Marla was already starting down the thin, winding pathway towards the building. Shane was about to call after her, at least warn her not to get too far ahead, when the first one leapt out of the snow. Then a second and a third. Before Shane had time to call out, Marla was swamped by them. Children, miniature lurkers in matching uniforms. Terry raced down the path, shotgun lifted, but there was no way he was going to fire. They were coating her, snapping at her arms and legs, and she was shrieking, trying to shake them off as if they were rabid ferrets, and she was just the nice lady who fed and watered them. One of them, he must have been no older than 6, although the darkness of his eyes suggested otherwise, flipped over from her back and somehow ended up lying in the snow at her feet. Despite having 2 others trying to clamber aboard, she raised a foot, the injured one, and slammed it down squarely onto the face of the child lurker. There was a squelch, and then she squealed out in horror as she realized that she had just put her foot through a kid's fucking forehead. "Marla, don't let him scratch you!" Terry was shouting. He was still looking for a clean shot, but she was wearing the things like a fur coat, which made it impossible. Marla knew that she wasn't going to shake them off standing up. What was it they used to tell you to do if you were on fire? Stop, drop, and roll? If it worked with flames, perhaps it would be just as effective with evil bastard children. She threw herself down in the snow. The many monsters on her back huffed and wheezed as she landed on top of them, before starting to growl and snarl once again as they snapped teeth in her general direction. Terry was hovering above her now, and Shane was dragging at the feet of one of the creatures, the little girl one. Marla rolled to the right and then to the left. The crazy part of her, the insane voice inside her head, said, "Why don't you just make a snow angel while you're down here, huh?" For her, whatever, a hell of a lot harder. It was like trying to drag a 300-pound fat man in an ice rink. The girl, realizing what was about to happen, tried to clamber to her feet, but it was too late. Shane fired once with the .22 and shattered its jawbone. The second shot put a red dot in the middle of the lurker's head, and she fell still, her mouth agape at a terrifying "oh." For a moment, Shane saw Megan in that face. He brushed it aside. It was, or had been, somebody's little girl, but not his. Not today. He turned his attention back to Marla, who had managed to shuffle loose of the boy lurker and was staggering to her feet. Terry, for a split second, didn't know what to do. He had to fire. He had to take it out. But the look on his face said that he might not be able to do it. The shotgun was ready, cocked, ready to rock, but his arm was trembling. Jared was as far away from the action as possible, momentarily, but now it was drooling. Black, thick sludge, which brought the old man back to his senses. He fired. The blast echoed through the playground. The lurker, which was already missing some of its face from Marla's vicious elbow, flew backwards, everything from the neck up completely obliterated. It hit the snow with a thud and rolled a few feet over and over. Terry breathed a sigh of relief as it came to a halt face down, a few feet away from a swing set. And then it was silent once more. Silent, spooky. Just another apocalyptic afternoon in good old Sandown, US of A. 20. "Down there," Moon said as the chopper hovered low over the forest. "Is that them?" Victor more or less flew towards the open door, grasping onto his massive second-in-command for stability. As he stared down into the darkening day, he saw it, the snatch, the whole point of the expedition, crumpled to within an inch of its life. "Fuck," Victor snapped. Moon sucked air in through his teeth as the captain's grip tightened on his arm. "Those fucking assholes." "Are they dead?" Randall asked. Though he remained in his seat, he was, all in all, feeling like shit warmed up, and the last thing he wanted to do was get to his feet. "If they ain't," Victor said, making his way to the cockpit, "they sure as fuck gon' be." Kyle wasn't surprised to see the captain's head appear in his line of vision. The crashed jeep down the embankment was always going to piss him off. What pleased Kyle, though, was that there was no sign of the group, and no real sign of injury around the demolished vehicle. They had survived. "Take us down," Victor said, although the way he spoke suggested he was close to just shooting somebody, probably Kyle, just to get it out of his system. "They're not down there," Kyle said. "I managed to get a good look on the first flyby, and I didn't see any sign of them." "Did you see any fucking footprints on that first flyby?" Kyle shook his head. He hadn't, but even if he had, he would have kept it to himself. "Then take us down. We need to figure out which way they went from here." "Wait," Kyle said, although he had already started to descend. "The jeep's fucked. What's the point? Why don't we just go back?" Hands, two of them, on the back of Kyle's neck. "They fucked up my vehicle," Victor hissed. "Do you have any idea how important that fucking Jeep was? Of course you don't. And you know why you don't? Because you weren't gonna be fucking invited. That's why. That was my ticket out of that goddamn place. What, did you think I was gonna stick around forever wiping asses and feeding ungrateful fucking mouths? Not a chance. I'm biding my time, and then we're out of there, and you can all go crawl back under whatever fucking stone you came from." Well, that told him. He knew that it was only a matter of time before the military men decided to go it alone, but he hadn't anticipated it so soon. "If this helicopter isn't on that snow in less than 3 minutes, Victor concluded, "you'd better start writing what you want on your tombstone." Kyle was a gambler, a bit of a maverick, but he didn't fancy his odds here. He took the whirlybird down. Any tracks left by the deserters had vanished, so heavy was that afternoon's snowfall. Victor had been annoyed even when he thought there was still a chance of recovering the snatch. Now he was positively unhinged. "They could have gone any fucking where," he snarled, pacing up and down through the snow. He couldn't take his eyes off the mangled Jeep lying at the bottom of the embankment. Even that was already half covered with snow, making it look as if it was emerging from the drift, not sinking into it. "They had to go that way," Moon said, pointing east down the road. "If they had doubled back, we would have seen them. And it would be pointless when they were only a few miles from Sand..." He struggled with the sign at the edge of the road, not because it was snow-covered, but because he'd never been one for reading. It wasn't because he was dumb, not in the conventional sense anyway, but because he had been brought up to believe that reading didn't get you anywhere, that sticking your head in a book all day long made you gay or something along those lines. He wished he'd paid no attention now, though, because he felt like a complete idiot standing there, mumbling to himself like fucking Rain Man. "Sandown," Randall said, stepping right up next to the sign. Moon felt relief at the perfectly timed intervention, but he also wanted to scream out at the top of his voice, "I'm not a fucking retard. I'm not fucking stupid." "Then we go to Sandown," Victor said, almost biting his cigar in two. "Some fuck's gotta pay for this, and those sons of bitches shouldn't have ever tried to disappear into the fucking night the way they did." David Moon, still trying to put the letters together on the impossible sign, said, "So we gonna make him pay for fucking with us?" It was a question, but of the rhetorical variety. Victor knew it, so didn't even honor it with a response. "Let's go," the captain said. It was starting to get dark. It was that strange, murky part of the day when you suddenly find yourself depressed for no apparent reason. Though maybe that was just Victor. "I just need to take a piss," Randall said. He moved around the side of the helicopter and lowered himself just out of sight down the embankment. "Well, hurry the fuck up," Victor said. "You leave your dick out for too long in this weather, and before you know it, it's turned black and dropped right off." Moon chuckled. Kyle didn't. "What's the matter with you, you miserable bastard?" Moon said to the pilot. "This is all gonna work out okay for you. It's your fucked up friends who are gonna suffer. Just be grateful you didn't go with them." That was a good point. He hadn't known anything about the attempted desertion. He and Shane had been out scavenging together on many occasions. Shane had never let slip about any sort of road trip. Would Kyle have gone if he had mentioned it? Possibly, though that would have also made him a target, and right now, the only thing standing between the good guys and the bad guys was him. Not that he had put up much of a fight so far, practically sucked their dicks for him so far. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth, though not as bitter as the actual act would have. Suddenly there was a scream, a blood-curdling screech from down the embankment. Moon pulled his rifle to his chest and stared towards Victor. Randall? It had to be. Go take a look, Victor said. If there's anything down there, don't give it a fucking chance. Moon was a big guy, the biggest in the camp, although a few of the men came close. Size in that moment mattered not one iota. He was terrified. The scream came again, and this time it sounded closer. Victor Lord was already loading himself in through the side door of the helicopter. If cowardice needed a persona, then Victor Lord was it. As the scream cut off, perhaps through force, Moon reached the edge of the road and stared down into the snow. Something had happened. The blood was enough proof of that. But Moon couldn't see where Randall had disappeared to. He's gone, Moon cried back to the chopper. Words passed his lips. His brain was still trying to figure out if it was such a great idea. When the captain's face creased up and his mouth dropped open, Kyle had a pretty good idea of what was to follow. You get in this fucking thing right now, Victor said, the shock of the pilot's defiance still fresh on his face. I will not hesitate. I will shoot you. Kyle was about to voice in no uncertain terms where the cap. He could also see the head dangling from its mouth. A wide-eyed, wide-mouthed soldier who had decided to go for a piss at the wrong time. He heard Victor cry out, though it sounded foreign to Kyle as his ears were all of a sudden packed with freezing snow. He took one more kick, this time to the side of the head, and that was all he could remember. That and the sound of a shot being fired. As he slipped into unconsciousness, he tried to remember whether he had ever read anything about deer turning vicious. Bambi would have been a completely different story if the titular character developed a taste for human flesh. Many of the survivors were huddled together in the darkness. A few of them, mainly the women, were sobbing quietly to themselves or trying to comfort their children. There was a man at the front of the room trying to calm everybody down. Joseph Abilowich, though small, had a voice that could travel, the kind of voice that could blow out windows if he wasn't careful. Ladies, everybody, please calm down. Everything's going to be just fine. Somebody here will be able to fix the lights. Though it wasn't just the lights, was it? The heating was also down. The temperature was already dropping, despite all the hot air being generated by panic and despair. Maggie Cox lit a cigarette and moved up next to Joseph. In any other time and place, they would have made a decent couple, the kind you would gladly have over for Thanksgiving dinner. But right now, that was not part of their agenda. Being widowed did not make you a target for every single wrinkle factory over 65, something that Maggie was pleased about. Does anybody know anything about engines? Maggie shrieked, blue smoke trailing from her nose, as if her soul was trying to escape. When nobody spoke, she added, Anybody know anything about fixing shit in general? Those Jennies down there are not flat-pack furniture from IKEA, a voice said from the back of the room. Maggie found the speaker and was unsurprised to discover Freddie Doosan standing there with his arms folded. The complete know-it-all, the kind of man that would profess to be able to do something, then run home and read all about it on Wikipedia. I'm aware of that, Maggie said, trying not to get into an argument with him. But since we don't have any official generator repairmen amongst us, we gotta take what we can. I don't mind taking a look, Freddie said. He pulled a torch out of nowhere, his ass, Maggie thought, and switched it on. But I ain't promising nothing to y'all. Maggie didn't think he would be able to fix them. She saw him for what he was, jack of all trades, master of none. Still, he was the only one offering to take a look, so it made sense to humor him. We would really appreciate that, Freddie, she said. A few others ummed and awed their approval, and Freddie Doosan's expression altered. He was the new hero. The one who could make everybody happy again, or something along those lines. "I'll be back in a few minutes," he said, snapping the torch around the room, highlighting individual faces as if he was trying to catch them in the middle of something unfortunate. "If I can't fix them, then we better start getting more blankets from somewhere. It's gonna be getting a hell of a lot colder from here on in." There were no other blankets. The soldiers had already checked the building. Pretty much anything that could provide warmth was in the main hall. Nobody said anything to Freddy, though. He was their savior. As he slipped out of the door, led by a trail of torchlight, Maggie turned to Susie Bloom and patted her gently on the arm. "We did the right thing," she said. "If we'd mentioned it, they'd have been up there untying him right now." Susie nodded. It still didn't feel right. "I know," she said, straining her eyes in the darkness so that she could make out the rough shape of the old woman. "What we need to figure out is what to do when Victor gets back, 'cause he sure ain't gonna be in the mood to forgive and forget, and it was obviously him that wanted you out of the way. He's not going to let this go." Maggie shrugged, her silhouette shoulders just visible. "Fuck him and the horse he rode in on," she spat, barely a whisper. "He's not going to kill me in front of all these people. The best thing I can do is stay close." "Safety in numbers," Susie said. "Exactly." It was the best they could do. No way. Not this guy. There was no way he was going to sit there like a fucking plum pudding when Victor got back to find that he had failed. The agony tore through his face, relentless. He winced, spat blood, and then rocked back, hoping that it would be enough to topple the chair and give him a better chance of escape. It didn't. He rocked, but only back to where he had originated. It was going to take everything he had, which wasn't much. In the dark, he heard a voice, muttering to itself. Torchlight momentarily hovered on the wall opposite, but then it was gone. Whoever it had been had decided mystery roamer to go away before giving it everything he had. This time he managed to free a foot. The binds around his ankles had been a lot less secure than intended, and they slipped over his feet and fell to the ground. "Ha, you fucking assholes. It's coming, and you have no idea." He whipped one of his newly freed legs up and placed it against the wall. There was a hollow thunk. He wondered whether pushing against the wall would indeed force the chair back, or if it's stupid. If it was broken, it was broken, but at least it was loose now. And in a few minutes he would be out of there, free to go about his business, free to unleash hell on the old bitch and her friends. The taste of iron in his mouth as he licked his lips made him ask the question, was it so bad, being one of them? The answer would come in time. 21. Shane didn't know whether it was colder inside the school than it had been outside, but it was close. Frozen mist clouded in front of their faces as they breathed, so much so that visibility was severely reduced. "I hate to say it," Marla said, though Shane doubted she really did, "but I think we were better off sleeping in the snatch." It was a ridiculous notion, but looking around Sandown Elementary, the best start they could wish for, none of the others argued. "Got to be somewhere in here where the windows haven't been put through," Terry said, pushing up through the group with the shotgun ready. "This is why I don't mix well with children." Shane smiled. "Nothing to do with the fact that you're a career criminal." Shane was a career criminal. And I'll have you know that up until I got slammed up, I always thought there was still time for me to have kids. "Good job you didn't," Marla said. The truth, though hurtful, was always available from Marla. As they reached the end of a corridor, there were eerie paintings hanging on the wall, or sellotaped lopsided, which only added to the macabre feel. There was a door which read, Mrs. Beetham. The top half of the door was frosted, but in the darkness that meant nothing. There could have been a horde of the little fuckers just waiting for them on the other side. They wouldn't know until it was too late. "Watch out for Mrs. Beetham when we get in there," Terry said. "I doubt whether she's going to be in the mood for visitors." Shane pushed the door handle down and gently pushed the door open. The room was empty, which came as more than a relief. It wasn't quite dark outside, which allowed the gloomy light of the remaining day in through the windows on the far wall. Shane led them slowly through the rows of desks. Chairs lay scattered and broken on the floor. The blackboard at the front of the room was covered with bloodied handprints. "Doesn't bode well," Marla said. "Those poor kids." Shane was immediately plagued with visions of Megan. Sweet little Megan. Would she have been at school when the outbreak occurred? Was there a classroom 40 miles away in the same shit state as this one? "No sign of the teacher," Terry said, making the sign of the cross. "Don't know whether that's a good thing or not." Jared was across the room reading something that adorned the wall, a poem, maybe, by one of the unfortunate children, one of the missing, or maybe the one that Marla had stamped on so hard that her foot had disappeared into its face. Without thinking, the poem seemed to have mesmerized him, relieved him of his senses. He yanked open the door in front of him. It led to a store cupboard, the kind that contained the chalks, paints, blank textbook, only this one had something extra. This one contained death. "Jared!" Marla screamed, but it was too late. She could only watch as he disappeared beneath infected children. Limbs flailed, black goo flew through the air, and Jared howled as teeth sank into his neck, shoulder, legs. Shane whirled on the spot. He had still been thinking of Megan when the attack happened, which was partially the reason why Jared was now beneath a sea of blood-stained uniforms. There was no way he would have allowed Jared anywhere near the shut cupboard had he been focused. His reverie had sentenced a man to death, and he knew it. The creatures didn't seem to realize that there were others in the room. They had what they wanted, and it was more than they had expected. How long had they been in the storeroom? How long had they been waiting? As Shane tossed one of the miniature wooden desks aside, he noticed the completely consumed cadaver lying on the floor of the store cupboard, Mrs. Beetham. She had been stripped, as if she were nothing more than a bargain bucket. Bones and tattered dress were all that remained. Terry unleashed with supernaturally fast. Shane dragged his foot out of the way and fired once into the top of Billy Bunter's head. There was an audible squelch as the bullet traveled through hair, skull, brain, jaw, and out into the ground. It fell off, thumping the blood-soaked carpet like a sack of potatoes. Marla was still screeching. Shane wondered whether she even knew she was. Probably not. Terry was loading the shotgun maniacally, but there was nothing left for him to shoot at least for now. Shane dragged Fat Boy off of Jared and instantly wished he hadn't bothered. Their friend was hollow. Everything from the neck down missing or lying next to him in a steaming pile. Shane wanted to scream so hard, but something caught in his throat. He soon realized it was vomit as he rushed across the room and upchucked until his stomach was raw. Marla cried, sobbed her heart out. Her legs gave way and she crumpled to the ground as if made of paper. And the night hadn't even begun, as the gloom outside lit the room in a haze of nightmare and despair. He woke to find that he couldn't move. He was paralyzed, both with fear and injury, and as he tried to blink the pain away, all he could remember was a horse. No, not a horse, but something like it, hovering over him. It was strange, really, because he had no idea why he was met with such a ridiculous image. Perhaps he was a horse rider and he had fallen off. That would make sense, though he had no recollection of ever sitting on a horse, let alone racing one. "Where the fuck did that come from?" a voice bellowed. He knew the voice. He'd heard it before, but couldn't put a name to it.
Another jockey, he thought. Yeah, that was it. He had fallen off his horse and was going to be surrounded any minute by the concerned faces of other riders, but that wasn't it. Not even close. Is he dead? Another voice asked. Check him. He tried to move, tried to give the concerned party a sign that he was indeed still alive. Nothing. He blinked, but even that seemed to hurt. If he's dead, Captain, we're well and truly fucked. Captain? Did they have captains in horse riding? The dim light above him gave way to darkness. Somebody was standing over him. He couldn't see a face. He couldn't see anything, for that matter. He's not dead, the voice said, but he might as well be. He's bit. A moment of panic washed over him as he tried to fathom what the looming shadow was suggesting. Bit? Bit by what? My own fucking horse? Shit, the second voice hissed. Shit, shit, shit. He was obviously in trouble. If something, his horse, had bitten him, it was bad. He could hear it in the second man's voice. Not a horse, he thought, and then it all came flooding back to him, all at once, which made his head pound and his heart race. Lurkers, zombies, a deer, the outbreak, the virus that had brought the world to its knees. He was bit, and he knew what happened to people who had been bit. What do I do? The shadow above him asked. Fuck, Captain, what do I do? No, he thought. Please, no. I'm not infected. Not yet, anyway. Maybe I'll be okay. Maybe I'm immune. Maybe... We fucking don't have a choice, the second voice sneered. Just get it over with. Shit. We are fucked. No, please... This, Freddie Dawson thought, is beyond me. He looked at the generators as if they were alien creations, something which had been built for no other purpose than to confuse the hell out of people. Why had he even volunteered to take a look? He was not an engineer. In fact, he had almost electrocuted himself changing a plug not long ago, which should have been enough of a reason to keep his big trap shut. You're just too damn nice, he muttered into the darkness. The real reason why he had opted to take a look was this. Maybe, just maybe, the switch had tripped. If it was something so simple and he fixed it, then he could go back to the main hall and people would admire him for his fine work. That was it. The reason why he now stood in the dark, scratching his head and hoping that the Jennies just decided to work again of their own volition. The temperature was still dropping. He could almost feel it gradually dipping, although that probably had something to do with the fact that he had been standing stock still for almost 5 minutes, staring at the hulking machines in front of him as if they had said something derogatory about him. Fuck this, he said, swiveling on the spot. They would have to freeze in the dark. Options were non-existent. And if any of them thought they could do any better, then let them fucking try. As he took one step into the darkness, something made him stop. For a few seconds he had no idea what was happening, but for some reason he couldn't move, and then all there was pain. His head flipped backwards, like a Pez dispenser, and fell off his shoulders. His body went the opposite way, thudded against the side of an obsolete generator, and landed, still spraying from the stump at the neck. Stepping from the darkness, Henry Colburn glanced down at the twitching body of a man he had never spoken to, and thanks to the fire axe in his hand, never would. He was a man on a mission. That mission was destruction. 22. Which had now turned into a blizzard the likes of which Victor had never seen before, was hard. For every 3 steps forward, you were lucky to cover 1 normal step. Beneath the snow it was slippery as hell, like climbing Everest without snowshoes. And to top it all off, Victor was constantly plagued by stupid demands by a man twice his size. It was ridiculous. If we make it to Sandown, Moon said, as if there was no chance of such a thing. Do you think there'll be something to eat? Victor sighed. It was all he could do not to just put a bullet in the idiot's head, or his own. I forgot to check the good restaurant guide before we left the barracks, sneered Victor. How silly of me. Now, if I were you, and thank God I'm not, I'd shut the fuck up. Don't say another word until we get to where we need to be. You're really starting to piss me off. All this nonsense about fucking food. I'll tell you what, he said, stopping for his Sandown was close. There'll be food there, Moon thought to himself. Lots of it. Through the first door, then a second. Henry Colburn knew what he was about to do was insane, but he had no choice. Victor Lord would crucify him when he returned. His failure to make the old woman disappear was enough to send the captain over the edge. His promotion was already nothing more than a pipe dream now. Might as well go out with a bang. The third door was concealed by a large aluminum locker. Scratched onto the front of the locker were the words, Army Life Forever. The irony was not lost on Colburn. He pushed the locker aside, knowing that he was only feet from destiny. He needed to be quick. Otherwise, what was the point? If he were to die alongside the rest of them, the object would be severely defeated. The door was unlocked. The locker had been enough to keep them safely incarcerated. For all Colburn knew, they hadn't even attempted to escape. Instead, settled in and enjoyed the daily menu which had been brought to them. He took a deep breath and turned to the doorknob. As he did, the sound of movement on the other side of the door reminded him that if he wasn't careful, he too would be lunch. As the door opened a little, he turned and raced the way he came. At first he heard nothing. He paused, trying to listen, striving to hear if they had taken the bait. Perhaps they had lunged for the door so maniacally that instead of opening it, they had fallen against it and slammed it shut once more. Wouldn't that have been just goddamn fucking typical? And then he heard them, slobbering through the corridor, growling and moaning. It was the sound of 4 hungry lurkers, previously captured in order to find a cure. But there was no cure. There was no saving the infected. There was only lurkers, weapons, deadly and hungry, and had silence. Are you okay? She asked. You've been staring out of that window now for almost an hour. You never seen snow before? She smiled, but he didn't turn to see it. I'm fine, he said, biting back tears. I just want this to stop so we can get back out there. Martha got to her feet and placed a cold hand on the back of his neck. He didn't flinch, although the way in which he closed his eyes at her touch made it obvious that her freezing fingers had affected him. As soon as we can, she said. You know that we'd be out there now if it wasn't for this godforsaken weather. Shane sighed. I know. It's just, things have changed so much. I hardly recognize myself anymore. What if we find them, and they don't like what I've become, what I've had to become? Marla stroked his hair the way a mother would comfort a child with a scraped knee. If they're still out, he blinked away a tear and smiled. No, you don't. Marla, this whole nightmare should have sent us all spiraling towards madness. I know for a fact that we should be raving, cannibalistic psychopaths by now. She laughed, as did he. And do you know why we're not like that? Why we still have our senses when we shouldn't? It's because we still have something to hold on to. Something that makes us feel. You're the reason why I'm still here. He placed a gentle hand on top of hers and squeezed ever so slightly. She knew what he was trying to tell her, and it hurt. He had a wife, a daughter, and he loved them so much that he wouldn't dream of doing anything to hurt them. There was nothing powerful enough to stop him from reaching them, and she loved him for it. As snow bounced off the window, they both turned to glance outside. Terry muttered something from the corner, though he didn't wake. The sleep that he had yearned for had finally come to him, and with the Bible balancing precariously on his belly, he snored, grunted, and slept the troubled sleep of a haunted man. 23. It was perhaps not the smartest thing he could have done, but it was too late now. If there had been another way to cover up for his idiocy, he would have taken it. The beasts were loose, and he was as far away from the massacre as possible. He climbed 2 flights of stairs, and by the time he reached the top, he was practically doubled over. Fuck, Colburn gasped, sucking in great big lungfuls of freezing cold air as if it was going out of style. After a slight pause, he continued, racing the next 2 flights without taking a single breath. Would he hear them? Screaming, begging for mercy? The silence of the night was sure to offer him some sort of audio when it happened. The thought made him laugh hard. But then he realized that there was very little to be happy about. He had fucked up bad. The reason why he had unleashed the captive lurkers was to make amends. Put like that, he realized he hadn't given it much thought. He reached the roof door and lunged through, using his thigh on the push bar. He was exhausted, but safe. The night was, apart from the freezing cold and the heavy snow, quite nice. He had not had time to prepare warmer clothes. Then again, he hadn't known things would have gone tits up so fast. Subsequently, he needed to find somewhere warm to hanker down, somewhere to wait for the helicopter, somewhere that would keep him alive for the next few hours. The thought of freezing to death on the roof had never occurred to him. He was still sweating from the quick escape, but in a few hours, it wouldn't be much longer than that, would it? He would be so cold that body parts would need to be surgically reattached, or so he thought. Victor won't be long, he kept promising himself. The mood the captain had been in before leaving suggested he was on a mission, likely to find the jeep, kill the thieves, and return to base. No dilly-dallying, no niceties, for they had forfeited such things when they had stolen the snatch. It would all be over before they even knew what had hit them. Colburn walked the length of the roof, almost slipping on the snow as he went. There was very little shelter in sight, and why would there be? It was a roof/helipad. He found a recess that was partially covered by an old copper pipe. As he wedged himself into it, he muttered incoherently to himself about what he was going to tell Victor when he returned. The old bag, yeah. She went for a snoop. You know what she's like. She must have found the locker and heard something. Yeah, that nosy old bitch. Would Victor buy it? Did it really matter? Victor would be pissed, but it was safe. And if it had come off the way Victor had hoped, it would have been highly lucrative for all involved. Plus, it gave Victor somewhere to dispose of the dead folk. Why waste good meat when you could feed the test subjects? It made perfect sense. And in a way, the lurkers were doing them a favor. There's nothing worse than the smell of a rotting corpse. Once you've smelt one, you never forget it. The incarcerated creatures had been grateful for the delivery service, and Victor, in turn, had been grateful to them for getting rid of the recently deceased. Win-win. A flurry of snow whipped into Colburn's face. The wind howled for what seemed like forever, and then came the first scream from downstairs. He craned his neck and turned his frozen ear in the direction of the door. No, he wasn't mistaken. There were others, screaming and shouting as the realization of what was happening finally sank in. Colburn smiled and waited for the chopper. A woman, Becky Dawlings, was the first to scream. She was the closest to the door, the closest to the shambling undead piling through it. As she screamed, her husband tried to yank her away. But it was too late. One of the lurkers, who looked as if he might have been a vagrant while he had been alive, lunged for her, slobbering black teeth, growling. It clamped onto her arm with both hungry hands and pulled her back. Within seconds, she was on the ground, covered by the tramp and an accomplice. The husband raced, screaming, in the opposite direction. As he screeched for the far side of the hall, he glanced across his shoulder to discover that his wife's arms had been torn away from her body, and though she was still alive, there was nothing left of her to save. "Take her!" Maggie Cox screamed to Susie, who was standing with a look of extreme puzzlement painted on her face. Kelly couldn't see past the tent, but she knew that something very bad was happening, something that made her heart leap up into her throat and tears stream down her face. Susie grabbed onto her daughter's hand and yanked her in, cloaking her as if she was a precious book that needed protection from a downpour. "Where?" Susie cried, trying to comprehend the unfolding madness. Maggie pushed her away, as if that was enough of an incentive. "I don't know," she gasped. "Just try to get her somewhere safe. This is bad. So fucking bad." For once, Susie didn't feel the need to reproach the old woman. It was fucking bad, and she didn't mind her daughter hearing it. "What about you?" Susie said, never once taking her eyes from the carnage. "I'm too old," Maggie said with a hint of indifference. "Even if I could run, I'd be nothing but a hindrance now. Go! Get out! Get anywhere but here!" Susie plucked her daughter up, God, she was heavy, and moved away from the tent. She counted 8 lurkers, but there would be more soon. If the ones on the ground, the survivors who had been alive a moment ago, were not beyond reanimation, then they would add to the numbers. Susie rushed for the side of the room. The main bulk of the survivors were in the center, some still emerging from their tents to see what all of the fuss was about. One man had barely popped his head out before a lurker bit into the top of it. It made the sound of a ripe apple being bitten into, before blood dripped down into the man's eyes, blinding him from the monstrous events. As his scalp came away, his mouth lolled open. The part of the brain that controlled motor functions had been torn away by the lurker's savage teeth. Susie looked away. In her arms, she felt Kelly sobbing. Despite everything that was happening around her, it was the rhythmic cries of her daughter that hurt the most. Everything was helpless. Even Kelly Bloom could sense it buried deep in her mother's arms. Susie could see the doors, the only way out. How could they have been so stupid? They had been living in a prison of their own, not realizing that if the worst happened, and now it had, they would be trapped. 6 of the lurkers were busy feeding, tearing chunks out of screaming people, but 2 of them remained on their feet as if they were unsure of what to do next. The trouble was they were standing between Susie Bloom and the door. As soon as she stepped away from the wall, she would become a hell of a lot more enticing to them. For the moment, they hadn't even seen her slipping along, but they would. She was at a loss. Everything was going to end, how had Maggie Cox put it? So fucking bad. "Come and get me, you filthy motherfuckers!" somebody screamed. "I hope you choke on my arthritis." Susie turned to see Maggie standing in full view of the confused lurkers. She was at full stretch, her arms in the air. Shit. She might have even mustered up the strength to get onto her tiptoes. The 2 lurkers didn't need a second invite, and rushed forward as fast as they could, snarling, snapping at the air like rabid dogs at a barbecue. "That's right," Maggie screeched. "If the bones don't choke you, then the morphine will." Susie couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The old lady went down beneath the creatures, but she seemed unperturbed, confident even. It was insanity. Susie turned away just as Maggie began to scream. She lunged for the door, out into the corridor, through an adjoining room, anywhere but there. The old lady's screams stopped and lowered her daughter into the corner. Kelly panicked as she realized her mother was about to let go of her. "It's okay. Shh. Shh," Susie said, trying to regulate her breathing. She flicked on her torch, a tiny pink maglite that she never thought she would use, and said, "We'll be safe in here. You just need to promise Mommy that you'll be quiet." As she spoke, she struggled with a box heavy with ammunition cases. She pulled it across, blocking the door on the inside. Since the door opened inwards, there was no chance of the lurkers getting in, and no chance of them getting out, either. It was a trivial afterthought, something that Susie Bloom would figure out once she had regained her bearings. "I promise, Mommy," Kelly whispered, sobbing helplessly and trying to stifle herself on the already sodden sleeve at the end of her arm. "Are we going to be eaten?" Susie shone the torch on her own face so that her daughter could see that she was telling the truth when she replied. "Don't you ever think that," she said. "We're in the safest place we can be right now. We just need to be extra quiet and hope they go away." The meek, trembling voice in the darkness said, "The old woman's dead, isn't she? I heard her dying." Susie sighed, a tear rolled down her own cheek. "She died saving us. That woman was an angel in disguise." When Susie turned the torch on her daughter, she saw a smile appear at the torture continued for an eternity, and she heard every single second of it. 24. She listened closely, hoping that her assumptions were correct. It had been quiet for almost 10 minutes now, or at least the 10 minutes she had counted in her head. Her stomach ached from consuming so much junk, and she really needed to go to the toilet. She knew if it came to it, she would just go right there, sat on the floor of the... She had her machete. She just needed to catch them when they least expected it. They're dead, she thought. If there's ever a time to catch somebody off guard, it's after they've died. The problem she had, though, was numbers. She had no idea how many zombies were shambling around the museum. 10 she could deal with, but if there were 20, 30, 100, it didn't bode well. What good is a machete if you ain't got room to swing it? She felt the first warm drops of urine like a woman covered in her own piss. Terry woke to find Marla and Shane sleeping across the other side of the room. They were interlocked, the way lifelong lovers might sleep, but there was nothing there but innocence. The room was cold, and body heat was all they had to work with. If Terry had known how cold it was going to get, he would have joined in, a 3-way cuddle. He left them where they lay. Sleep was hard enough to come by, and by God, they deserved a few hours. He was surprised that he had managed to get any at all. He had seen some of the most horrific things imaginable that day, enough to drive a man to insanity, and yet he had slept. He felt a momentary pang of guilt as he turned to see the covered cadavers in the room. They had at least moved Jared away from the lurkers. It was the least they could do. He didn't deserve to lie with them, stacked up like something from the aftermath of the Black Death. He had been a true friend, a good cellmate, and despite the fact that he had been weak and vulnerable in life, he had died a hero. Terry couldn't stand still. He needed to take a walk. He knew, however, that leaving the group was something that he would never usually contemplate. He had seen enough mistakes made since the outbreak, and he was loath to follow suit. He picked up the shotgun from the corner and headed out through the door, quietly closing it behind him. The silence that filled the school was eerie, but not unwelcome. It meant that he was safe for now, providing he didn't open any shut doors without being prepared first. God bless you, Jared. He knew he would be just fine. He ambled silently down the corridor, the Remington ready and willing to do any work needed. He reached a T and decided to take a left. There was no rhyme or reason for it, it just felt right. There must have been some sort of school play at around the time of the outbreak. There were posters everywhere. Beautifully drawn pictures of elves and a massive green castle. It took Terry a while to realize that they weren't elves at all, but Munchkins. The play had been A Wizard of Oz, and should have been performed on the 28th October 2011, about a week after all hell broke loose in Jackson State Penitentiary. The play that never happened, Terry thought. Poor kids didn't even get a chance for one final dress-up. Proud parents would have been eagerly waiting for their offspring's fabulous portrayal of a munchkin or a flying monkey, only to find that the final act had already played. Terry pushed on, ignoring the remaining posters with everything he had. The last thing he needed right now was more misery, and thinking about those poor kids, even the ones that had chewed up Jared so damned good, was intolerable. He pushed open the door at the end of the hall to find that it was still snowing. He was staring into the night, which meant that he had located the back entrance to the building. Good job, too, since it had been left wide open. Any number of lurkers could have crawled through it before now. He was just grateful that they hadn't. The snow had eased somewhat, but it was still sticking, piling on top of what was already there. Tomorrow would be a nightmare. They still had 40 miles to cover. Terry stepped out onto the snow, which crunched beneath his feet like a sea of crabs. He took another step, and then another, and then he saw something that suddenly changed his mood for the better. A school bus. Big, yellow, reliable, wheels bigger than the Snatch. Terry wasn't sure if it was real or if he was still dreaming. He walked around the bus, checking it for punctures or damage that would render it useless. Satisfied, he stepped back and gave it a cursory glance. It was a godsend, an actual sign from the Lord that they would reach Jackson the next day. Terry smiled. Not everything was shitty. "Move, old man, and I'll make sure you chew this bullet before you swallow it," a voice said. Terry lowered the shotgun to his side and slowly raised his hands. He stared to the heavens. "First you giveth, then you taketh away." Mysterious ways didn't even begin to cover it. Victor Lord couldn't believe their luck. What were the chances of finding them? He stared towards the school bus and began to wonder whether it would have been much use after all. "It was a deer," he said. "Fucking thing came out of nowhere." Moon winced at the mention of the animal. It must have been the very same deer that had torn Randall's head from the rest of him and proceeded to race through the snow with it dangling from its maw. "I don't give a fuck whether it was aliens," Victor snapped. "That vehicle was worth more than all of you idiots put together, and it sure as hell was worth more than some fuck— Oh, it was a mistake," Terry finally managed. He was about to lower his hands when he felt the cold barrel of a rifle press against his ear. "Look, I don't know what else to say. We thought we would be able to pick up some supplies while we were out here, medicine and food. If we had known how much shit it was gonna cause—" "You have no idea what shit you've caused," Victor sneered from the side, which meant the hulking idiot David Moon was the possessor of the rifle. It didn't make Terry feel any easier, and all of a sudden he developed the need to use the toilet. "So what now?" Terry asked, hopping from one foot to the other. The snow crunched beneath his boots, but the cold was somehow soaking through his socks, which made him dance on the spot more than he would have liked, considering the circumstances. Terry was expecting the captain to curse, show his disapproval at such an idiotic rescue attempt, grab Shane and Marla, and head on back to the helicopter, which must be somewhere near. Victor rarely went anywhere without it. "Take me to them," Victor said. He was moving around, though Terry still hadn't seen his face since they'd appeared out of nowhere. "I need to have a few words with that prick Shane before I put an end to all of you." Terry thought he misheard in the first instance. Of course he misheard. A death threat? Promise? From the captain was obscene, wasn't it? "Excuse me?" Terry said, beginning to lower his arms once again. When the frosty rifle barrel brushed the back of his head, he lifted them wearily back up. "You heard him," Moon said, poking him just behind the ear with the tubular steel of the rifle. "Now, I think you should get moving. This trigger freezes up. You never know what might happen." The school bus had suddenly become nothing more than a pipe dream now, an oasis, about to vanish for the last time. Terry could hardly breathe. The realization that death was only minutes away could do that to a man, and the irony was not lost on him. He pointed towards the open door which led into the school. "We decided to hanker down for the night," he said. "There didn't seem much point in trying to carry on in this shit. He gestured half-heartedly towards the sky. "I only just found this bus here. Otherwise, I'm sure Shane would have carried on through the night." "Well," Victor said, appearing from the shadows, "ain't we lucky that you didn't bother to check out back like you probably should have done. We never would have caught up with you." Terry pondered the fact and found the desire to kick himself hard. The captain was right, though. They should have checked. However, it was difficult to raise enough morale and bravery when you had just seen one of your friends die at the hands of kids still young enough to piss the bed. Terry didn't feel the need to mention that little episode, though. Why give Victor Lord any more ammunition than he already had, which was apparently lots? "In," Victor said. His coat rustled as he raised his arm and pointed towards the door. "Take us to them." Terry nodded morosely. He would take Victor to them, and then what? He heard what had been said, and since glossed over, they would die, perhaps where they lay intertwined. Terry would be next, his conscience dirtier than a meth dealer's. Was that how it was going to pan out? Was that how the Lord had decided Terry Lewis's fate? Terry began to crunch through the snow, slowly making his way for the open door that ultimately led to his final resting place. "And don't try anything," Victor added, "or you'll suffer more than you need to." "Thanks," Terry thought. "You're the best executioner I could have wished for." The three men entered the school. Victor remained at the rear and pulled the door shut behind them. Why let any unnecessary cold in, especially since they would all be spending what remained of the night there? Some, admittedly, would be breathing a lot less than others, but still. "It's just down this way," Terry said, jabbing a conspiratorial finger towards the corridor that lay ahead. "I don't suppose it'll do any of us any favors if I decide to beg." Moon laughed. Victor didn't. "Do you honestly think that you can talk your way out of this?" the captain asked. For such a short sentence, he made sure to emphasize "thus." How does that sound? Terry was speechless. It was the kind of offer that he would have jumped at once upon a time. The other one, Jared, was never making it back to the barracks, though. Not unless they could find a mop and a bucket. And Terry knew that he couldn't betray Shane and Marla like that. "Sounds like you've got yourself a deal," Terry lied. Even though he hadn't meant it, he felt a pang of remorse as the words passed his lips. Terry led Victor and his trigger-happy minion down the corridor, away from the room where Shane and Marla slept. He had no idea where he was going to end up, or what he would do when he got there, but for now, it was all he could do. He was in no position to take the men on, and even if he had made a move for the rifle in Moon's hand, the chances are he would end up decorating the school walls with his own lifeblood. As the air palpably altered, it was almost as if it had thickened, making it more difficult to breathe. Terry hoped that he had rediscovered his faith in time. He had lived so long without it. Perhaps God had forsaken him. Maybe, and this is the part that frightened him the most, it didn't make a blind bit of difference whether he had faith or not. What if he was going to die anyway, regardless? What if those years as a padre had been wasted, and there was nothing but darkness and eternal sleep? As those thoughts mercilessly assaulted him, he had to fight back the urge to turn to Victor and inform him of the real whereabouts of Shane and the doctor. He just about managed to retain what little faith he had and pushed on up through the corridor, heart racing so fast he could hear nothing else. As he reached the next passageway, he knew that enough was enough. He could lead them on a merry fucking journey all night long, but that didn't detract from the end product. He was going to die. He was simply prolonging the inevitable. "They're through there," Terry said, for the room was severely lacking in potential marks. "Can I stay here? I don't want them to know that I led you to them." Victor sighed, glancing at his colleague, who was shifting nervously from one foot to the other. When he turned his attention back to Terry, there was a slight glint of compassion in his eyes. Very obscure, almost non-existent, but it was there. "Okay," he whispered, "but don't try nothing, or you'll die here tonight along with them. You understand?" Terry nodded. "Okay, let's get this over with so we can go home." Terry watched as the two men headed for the door. He knew that the room on the other side would be empty, and yet he anticipated a miracle of sorts, anything to stop the maniacal captain and his overgrown henchmen in their tracks. They pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness. Terry closed his eyes gently. It was quite the request for somebody of his stature, but he would try his best not to knock anything or cause a row, since it was liable to get him shot. Behind him, the door clicked shut. They both turned, not knowing what to expect, and the relief hit them as they realized that it was just the door. The floor was soaked, and they tread carefully as they moved up the center aisle. At first, Victor thought there must have been a leak in the roof, or perhaps the water mains had burst and flooded the entire hall. And then he realized that it wasn't water at all, blood, enough to cause ripples in the surface as they walked, at least 5 millimeters. The aisle was wide enough for 3 people, maybe 4, which relaxed Victor somewhat. There was very little chance of his accompanying ogre kicking a chair and warning the deserters of their presence. Victor had Terry's shotgun strapped to his back, which seemed to take the edge off. He pulled it out and quietly removed enough of a glimpse to prove the old man had led them to the right place. As they reached the end of the aisle, Victor pointed to the left, the place where he wanted Moon positioned. He would take the right. The soldier nodded and moved across. Once there, he settled down just in front of the curtain and pulled the rifle into position just below his cheek. He watched as the captain moved away, but he could see a thin smile begin to curve up on his lips as he stealthily shifted. David Moon had seen very little in the way of wartime, apart from a short stint in Iraq, but that had simply been a peacekeeping tour, nothing nasty. This, however, made his heart race so fast he thought he might piss himself. He was literally buzzing at the thought of what was going to go down. Victor climbed slowly onto the stage, and for an older guy he was still pretty lithe. Moon expected to hear bones cracking or something. The captain took a long, silent breath before pulling the curtain across. With the shotgun raised, ready to fire, he screamed at the top of his lungs, "You fucked with the wrong guy when you stole my fucking Jeep." On the other side of the stage, pulling the curtain so hard that it almost came unhooked at the top, David Moon powered forward, his face exhibiting several expressions at once: anger, hatred, excitement, and fear. He was caught off balance for a moment as he realized what he had launched himself wholeheartedly into his worst nightmare, and now he was faced with an army of mini lurkers dressed up in silly outfits. At the front of the pack was a girl, or at least she had been when sex had been determinate, dressed in a blue and white dress. Her hair was pigtailed up in an innocent style, but as she shambled towards him, he knew that she was far from innocent. He managed to fire off 2 rounds, taking out 2 of the munchkins flanking the girl. The 3rd and 4th shots managed to hit the girl, splattering her dress and knocking her back a few feet, but it wasn't enough, and she kept on coming. Most of her right cheek was exposed, and Moon could see her teeth chattering away through the flapping skin. He was about to fire what would have been the final shot, the one that counted, when something latched onto his ankle. The pain down there was immense, and he was momentarily too scared to look. He shot, and the lurker in the blue dress, Dorothy, didn't have time to react as her head exploded in a geyser of blood and gore. He kicked out with his foot, the one that not hurt like a son of a bitch, and connected with something hard. Finally, he glanced down to find one of the mini-lurkers crawling back for another bite. Leaving a trail of straw as an army crawled forward, Moon could see, even through the darkness, that it was a scarecrow. How very odd, he thought. Just before he brought his foot down on the back of its skull, there was a meaty crunch as he made contact, and the creature lay inert. Moon could see bone through the glistening hole in his leg, which made him want to upchuck, if only there had been anything inside of him to bring up. He glanced across at Victor Lord and knew that the captain was in serious trouble. There were 6 of them, the little bastards, crawling on top of him, trying to get a decent purchase on any piece of flesh they could. Victor was wriggling, trying to knock them off so that he could reach the shotgun, which had been taken away from him, and lay useless on the stage a foot away from his grasp. He screamed as a witch bit down on his throat, and then he gurgled as she yanked away the flesh and began to chew frantically. The others, who were all dressed as winged monkeys for some reason, soon managed to find flesh, and they began to devour Victor Lord alive. Moon knew he had to run, and dropped his injured foot to the stage. The searing pain was enough to cause dancing white spots between his eyes and his eyelids. There was no way he could run, not now, thanks to a fucking scarecrow. He turned and threw himself off the stage, trying to keep a hold of his rifle, landing somewhere between row 3 and 4, and knocking chairs everywhere. He tried to clamber to his feet, but the blood-coated floor was too slippery, and he found himself face down in it, waterboarding himself. He lifted his head and saw, through the pain and sticky blood that coated his eyebrows, a shadow at the back of the room. Terry. He lifted his hand, urging the old man to come and help, but he didn't move. "Help me, you fucking asshole!" Moon cried, trying to pull himself up using one of the small plastic chairs. It fell from underneath him, though, sending him sprawling back to the ground. The man at the back of the room made the sign of the cross and raced for the door. "You get back here," Moon screeched. "Fucking get back here, or I'll—" And then more pain. He felt something land on his back, the weight forcing him into the ground, pushing his head down into the puddle of blood. He managed to roll over and found himself staring into the eyes of a wizard. The wonderful Wizard of Oz. The creature snapped with savage teeth, tearing Moon's nose clean away from his face with one solitary bite. Moon screamed as the flying monkeys went to work on the rest of him. 25. Shane and Marla were on their feet in less than a second. Terry screaming at the top of his voice had woken them, and they stared towards him with pure confusion and utter dread. "What is it?" Shane asked. He had the pistol in his hand and was aiming it towards the door that Terry had just barged through. "We need to get moving," Terry said. "Lurkers. Lots of fucking lurkers." Marla's concern was palpable, and she was already hoisting up Shane's Bergen and shoving it in his direction. "Where?" Shane said. He took a few furtive steps towards the door. "And why did you go out there? You could have gotten yourself killed." Terry wanted to tell them how to fucking— "Wait," Marla said, both hands extended and trembling as if she was afflicted with something particularly nasty. "Victor was here? What the—" "We don't have time," Terry interrupted. "I'll explain everything," though he doubted he would be able to give them every detail. "Once we put some miles between us and this godforsaken playground." Shane nodded. He had expected Victor to send someone out after them, but he hadn't quite anticipated the big man himself. "The bus," Shane said, urging Terry forward. In his head, visions of his family swam merrily around. He was so close now, yet farther than ever. "What happened to the shotgun?" Shane asked as they raced through the school towards a bus that may or may not still function. "They took it," Terry breathlessly replied. "I didn't have time to go grab it, not once those things started crawling out of the woodwork." They entered a narrower hallway. "That's never going to work," she said, crunching her way around the bus and surveying it as if she were a first-time buyer on a used car lot. The yellow paint of the bus was only visible on sections of the side panels. The rest of it was blanketed with inch upon inch of snow. "We don't know that," Shane said. He dropped his Bergen next to the door and located the handle. As he pulled it across, The door folded and opened halfway. There was a pile of snow on the step, enough to keep the door from opening fully. With his foot, Shane began to kick the snow away. "I have a question," Marla said, an undertone of pessimism already tainting her words. "Have either of you ever hot-wired anything before? I mean, I know you were both criminals, no offense, but if neither of you can make this thing go, then aren't we just wasting our time?" Shane sighed. "First of all," he kicked the remainder of the snow away and pulled the handle once again. The door opened fully, and he turned to smile. "No offense taken. Secondly," he stepped up onto the bus and pulled down the driver's side visor. A set of keys fell down, which he caught one-handed. Bus drivers aren't known for their originality. Marla smiled and climbed aboard. "Fluke," she said. "You would have looked like a complete moron if those hadn't been there." Shane stepped down and grabbed the Bergen. Terry climbed the steps. Shane could tell by the look on his face that something was wrong. "Hey," he said, pulling Terry up. "Are you okay?" Terry sighed. A plume of white fog danced in the air an inch in front of his face before dissipating. "I guess," he said. "I just wish things had been different in there." It took Shane a few seconds to realize that Terry was talking about Jared and the loss thereof. "There was nothing we could do for him," Shane said, patting the side of Terry's arm. "We just need to count our blessings that we made it out of there in one piece." Guys," Marla said. She was already seated and was rubbing her hands together and blowing hot air into them. "I hate to be a pain, but is there any chance we can try to get this fucking thing moving?" Terry smiled. "The Queen has spoken," he said, brushing aside the morose memories of a fallen friend. "You never know," he said. "This thing might even have heating." "We can only hope," Shane said. With everybody on board, he pulled the lever next to the steering wheel, and the door mechanically shut. He grappled with the keys for a while. His frozen hands were doing everything apart from what he wanted them to, before managing to get them into the ignition. "Please," he whispered. He turned them slowly and was pleasantly surprised to hear the engine trying to turn over, not quite starting, but almost. It whirred, looped a few times, and began to dip a little, which was Shane's signal to turn the keys back and try again in a second. It certainly wanted to go, so there was no point in pushing it, not yet. Flooding the engine was something he didn't care to think about. "See?" Marla said, rubbing her hands together so hard that if she was made of wood she would have started a fire. "Probably not even got fuel." Terry shushed her, which she didn't appreciate at all. To Shane, he said, "Try it again, this time with the pedal." Shane turned the key and pushed the accelerator down to the floor. Once again, the engine fought for life. He pumped the pedal, hoping to give it just enough to spark the beast into action. After a few seconds, he turned the key back and relaxed in the seat. Outside, the wind howled and rocked the bus gently from side to side. Everything on the inside, though, remained quiet. Shane took a deep breath and turned the key. The engine turned over as he pumped the pedal, and then there was an almighty roar as the bus came to life. "Oh, yeah," Marla screeched from her seat. "See, I told you she'd go." Shane fist-pumped the air before turning his attention back to the control panel. Where are the wipers for this thing? He played with a few levers and switches before he found the one he was searching for. The snow on the windscreen pushed aside and fell off onto the hood. Through the frosty glass, though, was a face staring back at them. Shane gasped as he realized who the man standing in front of the bus was, dripping with blood, missing an arm, an eye hanging down his cheek and flailing in the howling wind. Victor Lloyd was right. He realized that the bus was lever-controlled. The gears were on the dashboard. "He's getting up," Terry said, glancing through the side door. "And he does not look happy." Of course he didn't look happy. He'd been a miserable prick when he was alive. Now that he had an eye hanging out and a missing arm, he was hardly going to be the life and soul of the party. Shane rammed the bus into first gear with a crunch and stuck his foot down on the accelerator. The bus moved only an inch or so, but it was enough to cover the gears, and he was surprised at just how responsive it was, despite the inches of snow and frost beneath the wheels. At the side of the bus, Victor's hand disappeared. "I think you got the bastard," Terry said, alternating his gaze between Shane and the exterior. "Don't suppose you want to take a closer look," Shane said, already knowing the answer. "Let's get the fuck out of here," Marla said. Shane put the bus into reverse and was about to hit the pedal when the door in front slammed open. Victor had been a problem. The steady swarm of costumed children piling from the rear entrance, slavering maws and bloodied garments, would prove to be something else entirely. Shane hit the pedal and the wheels began to turn. The only trouble was the bus didn't move. "Take it steady," Terry said, clinging onto the center rail as if Shane was Sandra Bullock and they were about to hit a ramp. "They can't get in, so just take your time." Terry's words of advice did very little in the way of comforting the driver. If anything, Shane panicked further as he realized 2 winged monkeys were making their way around to the rear of the bus, where there was, due to safety regulations, probably a fucking emergency exit. "What are they?" Marla gasped, wiping the window to her left with the sleeve of her coat. It made no difference. The frost on the outside prevented her from getting a good look. "You ever see The Wizard of Oz?" Terry said. Of course she had. Everybody had seen it. Every Christmas for the past 50 years. Some channel would bang it on, next to It's a Wonderful Life or Mary fucking Poppins. "The one with all the midgets?" Marla said, the confusion in her voice palpable. "That's the one," Terry replied. He began to make his way down the aisle of the bus. "Only they were munchkins, not midgets." "Whatever," Marla said. "That doesn't explain what they're doing trying to cannibalize us." Shane gave the order to hold tight, and this time the bus did move. Something thumped the underside as the bus rolled steadily backwards. The tires met something, which lifted them a few inches into the air. "Fucking winged monkey," Terry said, and then realized the preposterousness of his words. He had never, in all of his days, expected to use the words fucking winged monkey in a serious sentence. It was all he could do not to burst out laughing. Shane couldn't see out the windows, so the wing mirrors were rendered obsolete. He was relying on Terry to tell him if he was about to hit anything, although the visibility out the rear of the bus was just as limited. A female lurker, dressed in a pink frock and a tiara, had clambered up onto the side step and was clawing at the window. Her tongue trailed across the glass, leaving a snail trail of black goo in its wake. She was, by far, the least fair princess in all the land. Marla switched sides so that she didn't have to look into the creature's listless eyes anymore. "Freaks me out," she said, feigning a shudder. The bus was picking up speed now, and the prom dress-wearing lurker was clinging on as if her life depended on it. Shane paid no attention to its ceaseless scratching, and instead occupied himself with getting the bus out onto the unlit road. "Keep going," Terry called from the rear of the bus. "I can see the gate." Shane turned back just in time to see the female lurker drop off the side, do a few rolls in the snow, and come to a grinding halt. "I thought she'd never take the hint," Marla said, rubbing her eyes as if a few hours' sleep were not unwelcome. Shane smiled. "How am I doing, Terry? I can't see a thing." "Okay," Terry said, straining to see through the tiniest hole in the frost in the rear window. "Slow her down now. You can spin it round here and we're out in the road." Shane discovered that he could breathe again. He'd spent the last few minutes doing very little of it. He brought the bus around slowly, still unsure of the controls and more than wary of the poor road conditions. Just ahead, the female lurker was on her feet and shambling towards the bus. Just behind her, lying inert on the driveway, were several twitching shapes, their papier-mâché wings flapping in the wind. Some of them were trying to get up, but they were too broken to make it and fell back down into the snow. Shane lugged the massive steering wheel all the way to the left as he reversed. He kept expecting a robotic voice to announce that the vehicle he was operating was reversing, but there was nothing. Apparently, safety regulations had come a long way, but not far enough. "That little fucker just won't quit," Marla said, as she noticed the approaching lurker in the pretty pink dress. She'd have been a real catch in a few years' time. There was something inappropriate about Marla's sense of humor, but Shane remained silent. It was all he could do to keep his concentration on the job in hand. "You're good to go," Terry said, giving a thumbs up at the rear of the bus. "Just take her steady, Shane. It's slippery as fuck out there, and we can hardly hope for clear roads the farther we get." Shane slipped the bus into first and began to crawl forward. Through his side window, which was now relatively free of collected snow, he gave the female lurker one last look before she started to get smaller and smaller. The road was, as Terry put it, slippery as fuck. But it was a lot safer than the schoolyard, and a hell of a lot more appealing than seeing the night through in a building filled with enough costumed freaks to throw a decent Halloween party. "Right," Marla said, turning to Terry. "Do you mind explaining what just happened?" Terry ambled up through the center aisle and sat a few seats behind Marla. "I'll tell you what I know," he said. And the bus rolled on. 26. She took a deep breath and pushed the door slowly open. Her heart was racing so fast that she thought, despite her age, she was about to have a heart attack. They were gone. The creatures, all of them, had left the dinosaur room. The scary thing was, and she had to keep reminding herself of this, they were probably not far. Maybe in the next room, perhaps destroying some ancient Roman artifacts or bleeding all over a priceless tome. It didn't matter. What mattered was she was out of the cupboard, her machete ready. She had begun to think she might die in there, cowering like a mouse behind a skirting board, hiding from an inexorably patient cat. She moved across the room slowly, listening for any movements. If they were nearby, they were certainly being quiet about it. The storm rattled the windows as it had done all night long. She could determine the difference now, however, between the howl of the wind and the moaning creatures, whereas the wind simply trailed off. She knew that she was no longer safe in the museum, that she had to get out before the place was crawling with the undead. The night was almost at an end, though. Was it possible to bug out at first light? Could she last that long? She was terrified to move, just in case they heard her and came back. If she were to accidentally knock something, or God forbid she should sneeze or cough, then there would only be one outcome, and it was something that she didn't want to think about. She slipped behind a display cabinet and crouched. If one of them came into the room now, they wouldn't immediately see her. Still, she wasn't comfortable with the thought that they would find her within a few seconds of shambling around. She stood once again and exhaled with frustration. She might as well crawl back into the store cupboard with the mop bucket and cleaning products. Being free from the place simply gave her 100 new things to worry about. At least in there she only had the problem of starving to death. No, she wouldn't go down like that. She had made a promise to herself, and she would fight, just as she had sworn to the very end. She swung the machete and strode across the room, ignoring the gigantic skeletal remains of some long-extinct creature. As if they could smell her determination, a trio of zombies came crashing through the door, falling over each other to get to her. Adrenaline, she hoped, would be enough to get her through. They were slow, impossibly awkward, and easy to finish, provided she didn't get cocky, provided she didn't find herself outnumbered. There were 3. She had fought more than that at once before, but that had been outside. The dinosaur room was cramped, claustrophobic. Outside, she had the freedom to run in any direction that wasn't blocked by creatures. Inside the museum, she was caged, trapped with the zombies. If she was forced against a wall, she would be royally fucked, and she knew it. The creatures all went for her at once, as if they hadn't eaten in weeks. Maybe bored shitless. "Come on!" she screamed, using her best war cry.
Her face was contorted, just like William Wallace, she thought, and her eyes bulged from her sockets as if she was ready to be measured for her special white jacket now. She picked up the fake dinosaur egg and pitched it as hard as she could at the closest creature. It connected with the thing's temple and sent loose flesh flying through the air. The creature, a woman in life but the farthest thing from one now, hardly responded. If anything, it spurred the thing on. And she ran a few steps forward, her momentum doing most of the work. Raising the machete, she whipped it through the air in front of the thing. The creature didn't flinch, not immediately. But then it stopped entirely. It was almost as if it had something very important to say, the way its mouth opened and shut. As thick black drool strung down from its mouth, its glassy eyes rolled up, and then the head, or most of it, slipped off the body. She had been lucky with that one. If it hadn't have lunged at the precise moment, it would have probably been on top of her right now, chowing down. The other two creatures were unsure of what the best approach was. One of them was staggering around at the side of the room, but she didn't think that was intentional. It was simply the direction its feet had taken it. The other one, who looked a lot like one of her old school teachers, Mr. Daniels, lunged, growled, and basically fell to the ground all at once. She jumped back, evading its flailing arms, and managed to bring the machete down into the back of its head. If it was Mr. Daniels, she thought, then that's what he deserves for all those boring science lessons. She twisted the machete. There was an audible crunch, and then a sound like a wet surface being rubbed down with a dry towel. The back of its head erupted upwards like a terrible geyser. It twitched spasmodically for a few seconds, but as she yanked the machete out, it fell still. She was still trying to figure out if the creature on the floor in front of her had once worn a baseball cap to school just to fit in, when she felt the cold, putrid breath of the third creature on the back of her neck. She was mid-turn when a hand grabbed her shoulder, and now it was her turn to moan. The snapping jaws of the thing were so close, so very real, that she could feel its beard running up and down the side of her face. She managed to put an elbow between the creature and herself, which just about kept those terrifying teeth from biting her ear off. She felt sick. All of a sudden, her stomach decided to somersault, and as she hoped for, the blade merely poked and prodded the creature's side, as if it were nothing but a recalcitrant pet, and she was the wielder of a rolled-up newspaper. She felt a claw. Talon? It sure felt like one. Try to tear through her coat. But she had prepared for such an attack, and her layers were enough to keep a pack of wolves from ripping her to shreds. They landed on the floor with a thud together, as one, and the creature made what was, ultimately, the worst move it could possibly have made. It dropped down, tearing at her coat, trying to get to the meaty goodness inside. The sound its nails made as they scratched away at the material was horrific, the kind of noise that sets your teeth on edge, like nails down a blackboard or cutlery scratching a plate. She knew that she had very little time, and so managed to get the machete between the creature's chin as quickly as possible. She sliced, pulling the blade to the right so fast that her arm almost fell from its socket. The gargled moan that came from the thing was enough proof that she had managed to slit its throat. The explosion of putrid liquid as it fell down onto her coat merely confirmed it further. The creature flapped its tongue around aimlessly as she pulled the blade through to the left, and this time she heard a loud thump as its head came off and rolled onto the priceless rug beneath them. The full weight of the thing came down on top of her, and she felt the air rush from her lungs to accommodate it. After a moment of struggling, she managed to crawl out from beneath it. For the first time in days, she had actually broken into a sweat, and it was not unwelcome. She wiped her coat down with what she had available. It just happened to be a piece of ancient tapestry that nobody would ever be able to appreciate again, and when she was satisfied that she wasn't going to become infected by her own clothes, she began to breathe again. It didn't occur to her that there were others, lots of them, roaming the museum like bored attendants at a thimble convention, but there were. She could hear them, scratching, moaning, trying to figure out where that wonderful stench of death was coming from. Her options were limited, and for once she realized that she had made a massive mistake in choosing the museum. Sure, with its bright lights and constant heating it was attractive, but they knew that. They must have known it, for so many of them to wander off the beaten track. Another mistake that she suddenly became aware of was escape routes and her lack of them. She had never, not once in the junk food seemed to be keeping her fully alert, which was very useful indeed when it came to fighting members of the undead. She stood in front of the splintered door and took a deep breath. The dinosaur room and the adjoining store cupboard had been her home for only a fraction of time that she had intended, but she still felt remorseful, knowing that the warmth that it offered and the momentary respite would soon be a thing of the past, relegated to memory. She moved, her machete swinging beside her, out onto the corridor and into the jaws of death. 27. There's a sign coming up, Shane said as he tried to keep the bus steady on the increasingly slippery road. Can one of you try to see what it says? Marla stood, cracked her back in a less than feminine fashion, and said, I'm hoping it says something about food. She made her way to the front of the bus, keeping a hold of the aluminum railings either side of her. As she reached the front, she glanced out through the windscreen at the blanketed road ahead. Shit, Shane. How are we even moving? He sighed, slowly, very slowly. The snow was so deep in places that the school bus lifted from the road. Beneath the bus, the soft noise of snow as it scraped the undercarriage was not too comforting, but they hadn't beached yet, which was probably down to sheer luck rather than anything else. The sign came up on the left-hand side, Jackson, 3 miles. In his seat, Shane shifted nervously. Although he had requested help with the sign, he had managed to pry his eyes away from the road long enough to read it himself. Marla put a hand on his shoulder. If they're there, she said, softly rubbing his collar, we'll find them. He sighed, an amalgamation of relief and tension, which were the toughest combination imaginable. Terry was a few seats back. He'd been given the unenviable task of cleaning Shane's pistol, which in all fairness looked about ready for scrapping. When he heard the whispering at the front of the bus, he reassembled the gun in quick time and headed up to see what was going on. We're nearly there, Marla said. Her look told Terry everything he needed to know. The moment of truth was fast approaching. Time to put up or shut up. I'm annoyed at losing the Remington, Terry said, unprompted. He was, of course, referring to the shit state in which Shane's pistol now found itself. Not your fault, Shane reminded him. You kept us alive by leading them away to that room. I'm eternally grateful for what you did. Losing the shotgun was a small price to pay. Marla planted a small kiss on Terry's cheek, which shocked him completely. Yeah, she said. We might never have woken up if it hadn't been for your self-sacrifice. Terry had known the risks, yet he hadn't considered himself a hero, not even when the captain and that fool Moon were getting devoured. He didn't speak, or couldn't. Marla's kiss had silenced him. So this is the first time we've been back to Jackson since jail, Marla said. The old gang, back together again, huh? Shane smiled. I thought I'd put this place behind me for good, he said. Just shows how fucked up a thing guilt is. We had to run, Marla said. If you remember, we were surrounded by fucking lurkers, and that helicopter wasn't going to wait all day for us. It's easy, thinking back, to say that you would have done things differently. I don't think that you could have under any circumstances. We ran. We're still alive, and we're here now. If Megan and... Shit. She'd forgotten what his wife was called. Holly, Shane said, trying not to sound too annoyed at her for the absent-mindedness, though maybe she had subconsciously forced the name from her memory. Her feelings for Shane had been made apparent back at the school. If Megan and Holly, she continued, had been there, had seen what we were up against, they would have told you to do the very thing that you did. Shane thought for a long moment, then nodded. Marla was right, as always, and though it pained him to admit it, he knew that there was nothing else he could have done back then. "Hey," Marla said, more excitable than she had been the rest of the journey. She jabbed towards a small window about what looked like a strip bar. The neon lights were still working, even after a month. 2 flashing female legs opening and closing incessantly. "Guess who used to live in that apartment?" Silence. Then Terry laughed. "You didn't." "I did," she said, laughing along. 3 years I had to listen to porn music from downstairs. It was back when I had been training for my doctorate, and it was the only place I could afford at the time. She paused, trying to remember something, some little detail that might have eased the tension further. "Then," she said, "the landlord had been a right bastard. I remember his name now. Jebediah Crunt." At first, Terry didn't speak. Instead, he gave her a disbelieving look, testing for holes in the story. "I swear," she said, chuckling. "I used to call him Jeb the Cunt. Son of a bitch wouldn't even give me my fucking security deposit at the end. Said I'd pissed all over the bathroom carpet, which I hadn't. How can a woman piss on the carpet?" Shane piped up. "You'd be surprised." He laughed. They all laughed, thanks to Marla's moment of reminiscence. And whether it was true or not, the tension slipped out of the bus and stayed out for the last mile to Jackson. The final mile, though, was where the nightmare began. They stared up to the road ahead, none of them able to speak. Cars were strewn across the road, covered with snow. A vehicle transporter lay overturned and stretched all the way from one side of the street to the other. People had been attacked in their cars on the day of the outbreak. Either that, or they had run for their lives, leaving their vehicles where they sat. The transporter was covered by a thick drift of snow, the Hondas it had been carrying barely visible thanks to the appalling weather. "Do either of you get the idea that we're not meant to get to the city?" Marla finally asked. "I expected this," Shane said, turning the key in the ignition of the bus. The silence that came was more terrifying than the view through the windscreen. "We were lucky to get this close." "Really not feeling lucky right now," Marla said. Shane pushed himself up from the driver's seat and turned to Terry, who handed him the recently cleaned and loaded .22. "What do you think?" the old man asked. "It's about a mile into the city. Whereabouts did you live?" "They lived with Holly's mother, the last I heard," Shane said, slightly perturbed by the current direction of the conversation. "In a house not far from the museum. I reckon we can make it in less than half an hour." "Without taking into account the lurkers," Marla said, ever the optimist. "And the fact that we're in the middle of a fucking blizzard?" Shane sighed. "I understand if neither is already allowing snow on board." "After you," she said. Shane turned and carefully lowered himself from the step. The last thing he wanted to do was slip, fall on his ass, and make a complete idiot of himself, though the hand that grabbed his ankle made sure he did all three. Marla tried to reach for him, but it happened too fast. Initially, she thought he had simply gone over, landed with a thump in the snow, but as he flipped over, she could see that he was genuinely terrified, staring under the bus as if the devil himself had made a camp there. Terry launched himself outwards, avoiding whatever Shane was staring at. He landed in the snow, turned, and immediately recognized the creature staring back at them from the darkness. Victor Lord's face was mostly gone, but his one cheek remained, flapping about on his oozing skull. Back at the school, he had been missing one arm. Now, though, everything from the waist down was gone. He had somehow managed to hold on to the underside of the bus for 40 miles remained of Victor's head. Bone fragments and flesh spattered the snow beneath the bus. The creature's teeth chattered maniacally for a few seconds, and then its head fell forward into the soft, white blanket. Shane kicked the still twitching hand off his ankle and lay still for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what had just happened. How the fuck had he managed to survive for 40 miles? Was he that desperate to make them pay for stealing the Jeep, or was it simply the creature's inane relentlessness that drove it forward? Shane clambered to his feet and began to brush the snow from his clothes. His ass was soaked, and he wasn't looking forward to spending the next few hours with his jeans clinging to him like cellophane. Marla was standing in the bus door looking genuinely terrified. "Am I okay to come down now?" Terry smiled before offering his hand to her, which she duly took. As she stepped down, she glanced under the bus. The fragment of burnt camouflage gave it away, and she gasped, her hand slapped to her mouth. "Wow," she said. Shane half expected her to follow it up with OMG or something equally as annoying, but she didn't. "Guess he really wanted to get his Jeep back," Terry said, dusting himself off. "Son of a bitch doesn't know when to stop." "Are we going to stand here all day?" Marla asked. "Or are we going to go find your family?" Shane liked her attitude. He pointed over to where the car transporter lay in the road, like a dead mammoth in the middle of an ice age. "That's the best way on foot," he said. "We leave the Bergen here. I doubt anybody'll steal our shit." "Why not?" Terry said. "We would." Terry was right, but Shane shrugged it off. There was no way they could carry the weight, not when they needed to be quick, and what if they came across a lurker or worse? The packs would slow them down, no doubt about it. "Come on," Shane said. He took one step before a guttural moan stopped him dead. They all glanced over to the blockade, to where the noise had apparently emanated from. They were right. A lurker, then another, and pretty soon a small horde appeared from behind the transporter. They hadn't spotted the survivors yet, but they would. "We need to get moving," Shane said, sliding away to the right. Terry and Marla followed. "They can't see us if we stay in the shadows," and trying to ignore the incessant racket of the shambling horde. She pushed forward through the increasingly crowded corridor. The creatures snapped for her, tried to grab onto her with broken fingers and bloodied maws, but she gave them very little opportunity to get a purchase. They were slow, awkward, and she was lithe, like a Russian gymnast, and she danced through them, heading for the museum entrance. As she slipped past one final creature, it almost hooked her. She spun to find a cowboy, or what appeared to be a cowboy, reaching for her with arthritic fingers. She was so unsure at what she was seeing that she almost tripped over it. The corridor opened up into the museum foyer, and she knew that she could make it. Shambling towards her were at least 10 of them, apparently led by the cowboy, who was eagerly lunging towards her with both arms, its hat held on only by a piece of elastic beneath its chin. She was so focused on the surreal creature that she almost didn't spot the one sneaking around to her right. Its grunt gave it away, though. She was thankful that they didn't seem to be able to keep their mouths shut, even when their food was at stake. She whipped the machete through the air and decapitated the cadaver where it stood. Its head shot across the room, hit a wall, bounced off, knocked over what was probably a priceless artifact, which smashed into more pieces than anybody would ever want to count, and rolled to a stop, still blinking. By the time she realized what was happening, the cowboy had launched itself towards her. The machete on its return visit sliced the cowboy's face off completely and the brim of its hat. She dropped to one knee and pushed the blade up through the cadaver's jaw, up through its brain, and out the top of its head. The hat lifted a few inches, balancing on the tip of the machete. As she retracted her weapon, the hat came back down onto the confused-looking cowboy's head. To an observer, it would have looked like the cowboy was merely being polite. "Thank you, ma'am." It fell to the ground as she pushed herself up onto her feet. She turned and ran for the entrance, for the cold of the night. As she lunged through the door, she realized that her fight had only just begun. 100 creatures, maybe more. were shambling around the museum grounds, falling over each other, bumping into things. She raced out onto the snow, the group of cadavers approaching from behind, giving her no other option. She whipped the machete through the air and took a deep breath. 28. At first, the snow was nothing but a hindrance, something that slowed them down. They were covering ground as if they were wearing ice skates on concrete, very fucking slowly. But the snow had its perks, as they found out. "I never came to this side of the city," Terry whispered breathlessly. "I was more of a West Sider." As he spoke, they were standing just outside a coffee shop, the kind of place that costs real money to drink at. Across the road lay a car on its side, the door jutting up into the air, showing that the passengers had either managed to escape or been dragged kicking and screaming. Shane was looking past the car. "I don't see anything," Terry said. "The wind." "It wasn't the wind," Shane mumbled. He readied the pistol in his hand, awaiting, well, nobody knew. But it was clear that he was spooked, and that was enough to set the others on edge. "Maybe," Shane said after a few moments. "I got it wrong. The sounds travel in this weather, don't they?" He was about to lower the .22 again when it appeared. It just jumped out of the open car door, a dog, or so they thought at first, and then it landed, a few feet in front of the overturned vehicle. All three of them recoiled. Marla actually squealed, which was a rarity in itself. Shane held a hand up, a sign for them to make as little sound as possible. The gun in his hand rattled, though, as he kept it trained on the prowling monster. A tiger, an actual full-grown fucking tiger in the middle of the street. You heard about things like this in Africa, but now it was happening in the middle of an American city. Shane didn't know what to do. The animal was obviously uninfected. Was it even possible for them to contract the virus? But it was a man-eater, nonetheless. They had slipped even further down the food chain in a matter of seconds. Marla's eyes bulged from her head as she struggled to control her breathing. She had seen tigers before, at the zoo where they belonged. There were no safety fences now, though, and she had never been more terrified in her entire existence. Lurkers were slow. They could outrun them. A tiger would chase them down and tear them to shreds before they even had a chance to turn. The beast slowly stalked the road. Shane tried to recall the countless nature programs he and Holly had watched together, but there had been nothing on there about fending off one of the predators should they appear in the middle of the fucking street. He knew that you should punch a shark on its nose, and if a pit bull latched onto you, the best way to get it to open its jaws was to shove a finger up its ass. Shane didn't think either of those methods would work on a 700-pound tiger. Suddenly its head turned in their direction. Its expression changed. Its mouth fell open, and a rumble from deep within its throat emerged. Terry wished he hadn't let Moon take the shotgun. One shot from that would have probably been enough to bring the beast down. The .22 that Shane was clinging to would do the job, but it would take a lot more than one shot unless they got lucky. The tiger suddenly lifted its head. Up until then it had been skulking. Its mouth open wide, it roared, and then it started to run, racing towards them, covering the space between them in less than a few seconds. Marla was already running down the street, Terry hot on her heels. She was screaming something incomprehensible as she ran. Shane was a few feet behind, but he was running backwards, trying to get a shot off. The pistol recoiled in his hand, followed by a deafening blast. If it was shot, the tiger didn't know it. There was a row of bicycles chained up in the road, which it leapt over in one bound. Shane fired again, and this time the tiger yelped as the bullet tore through its hind leg. It skidded for a few feet through the snow, slammed into a fire hydrant and buckled over, pained and confused. Shane turned and started to run, not looking back. The tiger would have been all over them by now if he hadn't fired true. Marla and Terry were 25 feet in front, rounding a corner. Shane heard something groan from the side, and immediately thought he'd made a big mistake in turning his back on the beast. Then he saw them, lurkers everywhere, attracted to the noise of the pistol. As they shambled into view, a sea of undead, Shane heard the tiger begin to roar behind him. He raced around the corner to find that Marla and Terry were holding on only one thing: feeding. But the tiger was hungrier. Shane, Marla, and Terry watched, dumbstruck, for a few seconds before they turned and ran, none of them looking back to see the carnage. The moment they noticed her, they began to stagger towards her, groaning, arms outstretched. She wasted no time in killing the first one, decapitating it with the adeptness that she had somehow taught herself. As the creature fell aside, another two were immediately after her. She wasn't sure whether to take them on or run for it. What good was it to fight them? There would never be a last one. At least she didn't think there would. It was like trying to fight off an intrusion of cockroaches. Sure, you might get the first wave, but what about the one that followed, or the one after that? Regardless, she sliced the freezing air with the machete, lopping body parts off the cadavers as if they were made of straw. More came, a lot more. And she suddenly found that even if she wanted to turn and run, she could when they returned to the barracks. Better chance of survival if he didn't get a stitch every time he ran more than 20 meters. "See?" Marla said, straightening up, though still breathless. She was pointing to a fence at the side of the alley. Barbed wire twisted around the top of it, but nothing too difficult, not with the padded jackets that they each wore. There were wooden panels just on the other side of the mesh, a clever tactic to obscure the museum fence from intruders, though if Marla knew about it, then the chances were that everyone did. "I'll take a look first," Shane said. He handed Terry the pistol. "If you see a fucking tiger or a bear or anything that's got more legs than me, you have my permission to shoot it." "I was gonna," Terry said. "I ain't kidding you. That tiger scared the holy fucking shit out of me. I mean, really." Shane began to scale the mesh. It rattled as he climbed. Chunks of snow fell from the spaces between the wire. His boots barely fit, just waiting for a head to pop up. The trick was to give as little to aim at as possible. He stared out across the museum grounds. 100 meters of untouched snow lay between them and the building. The fact that the white sheet was pure and untainted came as a relief. The rear of the museum was just visible through the blizzard, a largely gray structure that could have been an asylum if you didn't know better. "What can you see?" Marla whispered from the safety of the ground. When he didn't respond straight away, she called his name with a hint of impatience. "We're good to go," he said. And no fucking snipers, he thought, but didn't add. He pulled his body the rest of the way up and tossed his legs over the fence beyond the mesh. Marla began to climb, hoping that she didn't make a complete fool of herself in the process. It had been her idea to take the shortcut, which made her all the more careful in her ascent. Terry struggled at first, but once he got his footing, he was over the fence quicker than Marla. Landing on the other side, he wiped his rust-stained hands on the front of his coat. Marla came down a few seconds later and had never been more grateful to find her feet planted in freezing cold snow. "Come on," Shane said, turning and breaking into a jog. Marla offered Terry a cursory glance before she joined Shane. She couldn't stop thinking about the tiger, the way it had immersed itself in lurkers. What bothered her more, though, was that the tiger would have won that particular fight, and unless Shane knew of another way back to the bus, they would meet the beast again. They attacked as a pack, which was something she hadn't seen before. Maybe they were getting smarter. Perhaps they had evolved, regained a portion of their brain power, and working together for their food was just the start. She evaded 3 of the cadavers, rolling away to her left. As she scrambled to her feet, it didn't pay to lie down for too long, although she suddenly found herself exhausted. She swiped the machete at the legs of one creature, tendons tore, and the thing went down like a broken marionette. She was back on her feet now, and making her way slowly towards the gate that led onto the street. She turned and saw that it was only partially blocked by the creatures. Some of them had continued to shamble towards the building, while others had paid no attention and awkwardly made their way across the grounds in search of an easier meal. One of the things, A female cop before the virus had stricken her, groaned and landed in the snow a few feet away from her. She could see the creature's holster dissipated. She would have to use 2 hands just to keep it steady, and even then she was unsure that she would be able to pull the trigger without being propelled through the air backwards. She slipped the machete through the loops of her backpack and stepped back, enough distance between her and the nearest corpse to have a practice shot. Using both hands, she lifted the gun and aimed it at the approaching creature's face. She pulled the trigger, and when nothing happened, she panicked momentarily, before noticing the red dot on the side of the gun and the tiny switch next to it. Safety was still on. She flicked the switch, leveled the gun at the cadaver's head, and pulled the trigger. She didn't fly back through the air as she had half expected, but her arm did recoil as the bullet exploded from the weapon at 1,000 feet per second. It tore through the corpse's face, lifted the top of its head off, and exited, leaving a hole roughly the size of a tennis ball at the back. The creature immediately toppled over. She wondered how many bullets she had, before realizing that she was better off with the machete, at least for now. She clicked the safety back on and shoved the gun into her coat pocket. Shane stopped jogging as the gunshot echoed around the grounds. It sounded as if it came from everywhere all at once, though he knew that it was close. Was someone firing at them? Had Shane been right about the snipers? The shot sounded close, but not near enough to have been meant for them. There were no holes in the snow around them either, which meant that they were not the intended targets. Either that or the sniper was the worst fucking shot in the world. Shane, that was close, Marla said. She looked like she might start to cry at any moment, though that might have just been the freezing cold wind making her eyes water. Lurkers don't fire guns, Shane said, which means there's a survivor. Terry nodded. Yeah, a survivor with a gun who could quite easily confuse us for lurkers in this half-light. He was right, but they had to find other survivors, didn't they? That was one of the reasons they had returned to Jackson, to search for living souls, to locate and help the uninfected. It must have come from the front, Shane said, largely clouded by the white fog that was his breath. The street. Marla sighed. She already knew what Shane was thinking. It was in his nature to get involved, and the more time she spent with him, the more she noticed her own fear dissipating. Without another word, they moved slowly towards the museum. First, nothing happened. It was wedged somewhere between its collarbone, and no matter how much she struggled to pull it free, it remained firmly stuck. For now she was controlling the corpse, keeping it at a distance, making sure that it didn't succeed with its advances and take a chunk out of the top of her head. Why did I have to be so small? With one final almighty yank, she managed to pull the blade free. There was an audible squelch. The unfazed corpse looked like it might drop, but managed to compose itself, its head hanging half off, its eyes bulging from their sockets. She swung the machete, severing the head completely, and now the cadaver dropped to the snow, squirting a sickeningly dark torrent from the stump. She scrambled back, hoping to make enough purchase on the snow to give herself some space. They were coming thick and fast, and although she knew she could run at any moment, she had come to the conclusion that it would do no good. Sooner or later, she would have to fight them. Why not now? Why not here? She couldn't think of a reason to run anymore. They stood at the corner of the building, the blizzard whipping against them, the half-light of the approaching morning doing very little in the way of comforting them. It didn't matter if it was day or night. Those things weren't nocturnal. It wasn't as if they went away when the sun rose, the way they would if they were fucking vampires. But weren't zombies part of the same mythology? They used to be, but apparently not anymore. They were real. Vampires remained firmly encased in the realms of fiction, though nobody had ever expected the dead to rise and eat the living, so you never knew what the future might have in store. Shane was the first to see the horde, and immediately knew that he had made a serious mistake. There were too many of them. Way too many, if you considered the gun-to-survivor ratio. There was a way past them, but that involved running, a lot of running, and they were already chasing the next breath as if the air was pure carbon. Shane was about to suggest trying to find another way around. Perhaps the other side of the museum offered more in the way of shadows and less in the way of flesh-eating corpses, when Marla gasped and slammed her hand to her mouth hard enough to loosen teeth. "I see him," Terry said, straining his eyes through the gloomy half-light. "In the center." Shane had no idea what the two of them were talking about. All he could see was lurkers, a fuckload of them. Shane couldn't speak on behalf of the others, but he wasn't feeling up to much in the way of fighting. The cold had sapped his strength.